Hello, Cheryl, and
Hi, Deb.
welcome to the Well Writer Chats. I'm so glad to have you here.
I have just been looking forward to seeing you in person, and thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really grateful to have you, and it's fun to find out that we are sort of neighbors, really close compared to the rest of the country.
Yes.
We are Pacific Northwest, but not only that, we are on the same side of the Cascade Mountains. So similar environments. And what are we, probably maybe 90, 100 miles apart? Something like that?
Probably. Yeah, we've got some
Yeah.
water to go around. And
So Cheryl Bostrom is the author of two nonfiction books. She has the Pacific Northwest for most of her life. She's a naturalist, a photographer, an award-winning author. She's lived in the rural and wild lands that infuse her writing, which just excites me because we share some of the same environment. Her work has appeared in a variety of publications, including the American Scientific Affiliation's God and Nature magazine, for which she's a regular photo essayist. She's a member of Red Bud Writers Guild, and she has also authored two nonfiction books, and this is her first novel. And her first novel is Sugar Birds, which, can you show us?
Didn't they do a beautiful job? Isn't that cover? Yeah.
They did an absolutely beautiful job.
Yeah.
And if you are new to Cheryl Bostrom, you haven't heard of her, and if you haven't heard of Sugar Birds, it is getting such great reviews and press, and I am absolutely excited to dig in because in fact, when I was reading through some of the endorsements and recommendations that you received, I thought, oh my goodness, she's like speaking my language here, because these are two of my absolute favorite books. I mean, Pilgrim at Tinker Creek is an oldie but goodie, but Where the Crawdads Sing is new and still on the bestseller list. But Cheryl's book, Sugar Birds, people are comparing comparing her book to these fantastic, beautiful works of literature, really. And that's actually the genre that we're going to talk about briefly. Cheryl's book, Sugar Birds, is a literary fiction book, which is different from general market fiction in a way. So it's not a mass market kind of paperback. It is a very specific kind of book or kind of fiction that is really the makings of, I think sometimes, often, a classic. Here's one of the things that is a descriptor of the kind of book that Sugar Birds is. It immerses readers in a layered, evocative coming-of-age story set in the breathtaking natural world where characters encounter the mending power of forgiveness for themselves and for those who have failed them. So this story, I noticed does it take place up here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's a fictional world in the county, in Whatcom County, where we live, and it's set in 1985. So it captures a lot of the rural areas as they were then, and they've changed quite a bit, but there's still very identifiable features. But I mixed up the landscape a little bit, changed some town names, and took it from there. But
So,
when you were talking about genre, genre is an interesting animal, and even with Sugar Birds, even the concept is a mixed genre because it's literary fiction, but it also is tailored for the general market. And one term that's been used for that is upmarket fiction, which means that it's character driven, but it still has a compelling plot. And so there's your first mix on genre, I guess. Would be thinking about those two elements.
So upmarket fiction, say that again. Upmarket fiction.
Well, upmarket fiction has literary components, which means that you're also looking at being character driven, and the characters do drive this plot, and yet, and I'm very excited that people are calling it a page turner because it does have a compelling plot and a distinctive character arc, which sometimes literary fiction doesn't have. And yeah, so, and that was my goal. My prayer was that I could accomplish that. And so that's, yeah, so that's upmarket fiction.
That is a really good distinction, because I hear that upmarket fiction. I see that label often in what agents are looking for. When you read a description about what kind of work maybe an agent is looking for, you'll see that descriptor, upmarket fiction, which isn't really a genre description that you hear in school or that you might have learned in school. It's a completely different vocabulary for these kinds of books than perhaps maybe, I mean, I see that you have a master's
In
and
English.
is it in English? Yeah. So so the term upmarket wasn't probably part of it wasn't probably part of the vocabulary when you're studying literature, classic literature and all of that, but it is a category for publishing. And that's an important thing to know.
And it's a category that, like you say, that agents will ask for because they want something that can sustain a market presence. But I haven't seen it listed in the genre lists. I think an important distinction is whether or not you're adapting your characters to fit a preconceived plot, or whether your characters are as developed and layered, fully fleshed thematically and dimensionally, so that you're immediately drawn to those characters and you really, really care about what happens to them. It's less about the author's agenda for the plot, although the plot still has to have its act 1, act 2, act 3. It still has to have its full arc, but the characters will drive it. And so when you have that, then you can chew on the words and you can delight in the sentence structure, but you still want to keep turning the pages. And they're the kinds of books that I like to read, so that's what I had hoped to write.
Oh, I love that. I love that. And that too, those are the kinds of books that I also like to read, which is why your book is going on my list. Immediately, as soon as we get off this call. You have been a nonfiction writer and writing about nature, and a photo essayist and photojournalist. How did that transition from that to writing a fiction novel? How did that happen for you?
Well, I finally had to come to terms with the fact that I was terrified to write fiction, and I had dodged it for most of my life. Done a lot of editing for other people. Had been a columnist. Had written a lot of nonfiction in various forms and poetry, and yet the thought of writing fiction terrified me. But I can remember as far back as being 10 years old and telling my family that that's what I wanted to do. And I can think of other times, just benchmarks along the way, when I knew that was something that I really wanted to, and I figured I better do it. So it started out as Sugarbirds began actually as something that I wanted to write for my newborn granddaughter. And I had written a sketch for a critique group about a young girl and a fire, and submitted it, and we got the response to it. And a number of people in that group encouraged me to continue to develop that story. And I thought about it, but I kind of tucked it away. And again, it was me not having big enough possibility thinking to believe that I had the tools to write long form fiction. And I didn't. I have a master's degree in English, and I've done a lot of stuff in the writing world. But when I started to write this, I realized that there were so many things I didn't know and that I needed help. So that was what got me into that group initially. But let's see, what was I going to say about that? So I started writing it as a YA story, and this little girl wouldn't leave me alone. She woke me up at night. She followed me when I was outside, and I spend an awful lot of time outside with my camera, and we've always lived in the country, and I'm just outside a lot. And I just started seeing her places. And so I started working with the story, and I kept running into roadblocks and realized that I didn't know what I didn't know. So I contacted a developmental editor, and she showed me how to keep the story within the rails. And there's the thought about pantsers and plotters. Have you talked about that? Um, and I don't know that people are necessarily one or the other, although I do have friends who have walls of Post-it notes with their entire story on the wall. And then once that's complete and they have the entire plot conceived, they know where everything's going to take place, they've got their scenes laid out, then they start writing. And I'm not a linear thinker, and I think more like a camera coming into focus. And yet this developmental editor helped me. She helped me lay out the trajectory of the story in a way that I wouldn't end up off on a rabbit trail and have to throw away 150 pages because I'd gone the wrong direction. And so I knew where I was going. The scenes developed. It was like looking through fog because I could see far enough ahead that I knew I was headed in the right direction. But then as I started to write, these characters would talk to me. And I had heard that happened, but I didn't realize how magnificent it is when you're waiting, when you're writing, and your character says, no, it's got to be like this. And I just felt like a scribe, or like the UPS girl, right? I'm just delivering. It was just great fun. So anyway, I wrote it as a YA, but I ran into problems with genre there because I have two protagonists in a dual narrative. One girl's 16, and when you're writing YA, readers read up. They read to a higher age. But the predominant protagonist is a 10-year-old girl. And this little girl accidentally lights a tragic fire, and she's horrified and terrified, guilt-ridden. She sees her parents hauled out of this fire, and she believes she's killed them. So her dad's an arborist and was in the Alaska Forest Service, and he's taught her a lot about the woods and a lot about survival, and she flees downriver in this little raft that she's gotten for her birthday, and she hides in the woods where nobody can find her. And so in writing her as a 10-year-old, I just kept having people say, no, she's got to be 13 or she's got to be 14. Well, she wasn't 13. She's 10. She's a 10-year-old little girl. And so that ran into issues with the YA genre in the first place. And so that gave me pause. Then I entered the story in a couple of competitions, and it took first place in a couple of competitions. And I thought, oh, maybe there's some possibility here. Maybe this will work. But then I started talking to some agents about it at writing conferences and so forth. And the more I tried to work with the YA genre, I realized that I couldn't, that it wasn't ready yet. So I corresponded with an editor who's worked with some major books, just on a long shot, just thinking maybe she'll agree to work with me. She liked the concept, and she said, and she read my manuscript, and she said, well, she says, the story's intriguing. She says, and I'll work with you. She says, but I'm not sure you're going to want to work with me. I said, why wouldn't I want to work with you? She says, because your revisions are going to be arduous, and you have a lot to learn. And I told her at that point, at the prompting of a number of people, of editors and agents, that the book really did belong in the adult market. That took the 10-year-old thing out of play, and thematically, it had adult themes in it that young readers, while they enjoy the story, they don't have the life experience to interact with the characters in the same way. And I think it's a much richer novel for those of us who have children, or who have or who have experienced tragedy at levels that are really beyond our control. So anyway, so that was the switch from YA to so I worked with her then for 2 years and rewrote the manuscript. So all in all, this has been a 5-year process. And at the point that revision was done, and it was many revisions, I went over it many, many times, because every time I would rewrite it, I'd learn something new, and I'd realize that I had to rework it. Then it was ready for the adult market. And Should I just go ahead and talk about the
Oh,
other
yes,
switch?
yes,
Okay.
yeah.
Um, um, so I was at a writing conference at Mount Hermon in California, on the Mount Hermon Christian Writers Retreat,
Uh-huh.
and I met with an acquisitions editor from a big Christian publishing house where I have one of my books, one of my nonfiction books, and we were talking about nature novels, and Crawdads had just come out, and it was very, very exciting to me because as I had talked to people about both at bookstores and agents, nature novels were just not a thing. They were in
Mhm.
YA, and that was another reason that I had steered toward YA. But nature novels had really gone out of vogue in the market,
Mm.
and I thought, but there has to be a huge market for nature novels, for
Yes.
people who want to be in the natural world and have a story with all of the metaphor and all the life and beauty and possibility in the natural world, and also have the natural world as an antagonist. There had to be a market. Well, anyway, I was at
Mhm.
this conference and I'm talking to acquisitions acquisitions editor from this big house, and she was intrigued by it. She had read, and she named a number of novels. The Great Alone is one, Kristen Hanna's
Mhm.
book, an older book, Layfinger's Peace Like a River,
Mhm.
the Crawdads book. And so she was pretty excited about it. She wanted to see the manuscript. So I sent it to her, and it made it to her pub board. It made it to the pub board, and then it stalled. And I thought, and I had a contract in hand from a secular publisher. And I thought, I don't want this book to go in. I realized, how can I say this? I wanted this book to be a book written by, um, I'm a Christian author, I'm a Christ follower who writes upmarket fiction for the general market. I wanted it to be a book that people who love the natural world could still enter and find a beautiful, compelling story. But if they wanted to engage questions about God in suffering, questions
Mhm.
about how do you transcend uh, grief and guilt um, that is so devastating that there's nothing
Mhm.
humanly possible you can do to overcome it. I have an autistic character in the book, and there's a large market of people who would love to see an autistic hero and
Mhm.
somebody who's written from a character who's written as an authentic person on the spectrum with autism,
Mhm.
whose thought process you can hear. And I'm really wandering all over the place, aren't I?
That's okay. That's okay. This is good. That you weren't necessarily writing for a Christian market, but that you wanted to be a writer, an artist who is a Christian, but whose work has a broader market than that. And that's
Mm-hmm.
something that is inspiring to me, and I think is inspiring to a lot of the people who connect with the Well Writer, the Instagram account, that is the thing that they're looking for. What is that element of, I want to write something really beautiful for people who aren't necessarily Christians or even spiritual to engage with
Mm-hmm.
and see the beauty that can come from see the beauty, but also that can come from a writer who is.
It's not an agenda novel.
Yeah,
It's not, and I don't mean that disparagingly at
no.
all, because there's some beautiful, beautiful Christian fiction,
Mm-hmm.
but it's to engage people multidimensionally and to have them be asking questions that isn't really engaged in the popular culture today.
Mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of nature lovers who will really enjoy this book. And that's just, the natural world feeds my soul, and I know there are other people like that as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, one definition of the difference between Christian fiction and secular fiction is that if you remove the Christian thread, Francine Rivers said this, that if you remove the Christian thread from your story, do you still have a book, or
Mm.
does the story disintegrate? And Sugar Birds is a book that if you remove the Christian thread, or just the the contemplations about Father God, as because Aggie's dad is a follower of Christ who teaches his daughter a lot about the character of God through the natural world. But she thinks she's killed her parents, and she is hiding in the woods like a fugitive. And she's asking herself these questions in her 10-year-old voice about where is God in a situation like this, and she really grapples with that. And yet readers will discover their own answers, because there are also characters who really chafe at God in the book. And so, yeah, if you take Sugarbirds and you remove the Christian or the spiritual thread from the story, you still have a great story, still a page turner. You still have resilient girls, two resilient narrators, and a host of characters that you really can love, that do beautiful, resilient, make beautiful, resilient choices in the heart of some really awful stuff. And I don't believe that readers will feel that they're in the wrong place if they're reading this story, if you know what I mean.
Yes. Yeah, I know what you mean. I appreciate all of that. That there's so much. I think there's so much to your story of Sugarbirds, and finding the right place for it, and discovering is a good word. Discovering it in the process, your own process of writing, your process of bringing it to the market. All of the things that challenged perhaps maybe what you originally thought the book would be, and how it turned out. I think that's an important thing to remember when we start writing something, especially perhaps a work of fiction, where maybe you don't have quite the agenda that you do when you are writing a nonfiction book, and you haven't maybe worked from an outline, or it's a big difference.
Yeah, it's huge. It's just huge. And I was just, if I had known if I had known the course of this, I don't know, I might have just hidden under a rock, because because I didn't know what was coming, but in retrospect, I am glad that I took a deep breath, and it was a very prayerful decision to pull it from this big publisher, from their pub board, and then sign the contract with the secular press. And it is going places that my other two books didn't go, and that's a lot of fun. There's also a community. There's also a thread in the story. In some of the preliminary information you had sent me that asked about subgenres, and when you have when you're going into the fiction genre, there's just all kinds of stuff. There's mental health, there's family, there are relationships, there's romance, there's suspense, and suspense, by the way, as a subgenre, is when the reader has an idea of what's going on, but the character doesn't. And so readers can see what Aggie doesn't, and she's the girl in the woods. But in a thriller, for instance, which is another subgenre, nobody knows. It's and what's happening. The readers are on the edges of their seats. The characters don't know what's happening. So that's another difference in genre. And Sugarbirds fits in the suspense category. It also fits in a coming of age subgenre. Nature, outdoors and nature is another subgenre that you'll see listed. I've seen it listed as a romance, and it does have some romance in it, but not in a genre way. There's an element to that will attract certain readers. But one thing that happened with my publicist was that she submitted the book to NetGalley for reviews, and they put genres underneath the listing when they send the book out to readers there as well. So Sugarbirds was submitted to NetGalley as a coming of age story. Well, NetGalley doesn't have a coming of age category. So then it landed in front of new adult. And Sugarbirds is not a book for new adult. It's the 18 to 28. usually edgier, much more,
Mhm.
a lot more sexuality involved, a lot, just edgier fiction often, not always,
Yeah.
but often. And so I was a little nervous about that. And they switched it to literary and general fiction and outdoor nature fiction after that couple of days, but not before a number of people had reviewed it. So that was a good experiment, I guess, to see
Uh-huh.
how did it resonate in that market. And some of those
Mhm.
reviews are starting to come in, and I don't think they have the same response to the book, but it's favorable. So
Yeah.
I'm thankful. Um, what else you want to ask me about genre?
I think that you have answered so many questions that I run into myself. I'm asking these same questions right now of my next project. Where does it belong? Um, you know, and some of that's, I mean, a lot of it's out of my hands, it's out of my control. But I love the reminder with fiction. And you hear this from people like Madeline L'Engle or, other authors where your characters take you where they want to go.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a really great reminder that sometimes we want the answers ahead of time, but we
Mm-hmm.
just need to write it. We just need to write it and finish it and then see what's coming. I love that with the fiction that you went on a journey with it,
Mm-hmm.
and you didn't have to know ahead of time. It wasn't laid out for you ahead. And that sometimes that we get hung up on that of I have to know from the get-go if this is going to be this kind of novel or this kind of novel or this kind of novel before we even start writing it.
Yeah, and that's a really big point. If I could just throw something in, I think
Mm-hmm.
when you can release assumptions, you have more room for an anointing of your imagination.
Mm-hmm.
and and also fiction is a beautiful platform in which to tell the truth. I mean, it's all made up, but you can tell the truth with greater freedom, maybe than, at least I feel like I can, than I could just tell the truth through these lives and through these stories. And yeah, and I love that.
Cheryl's book, Sugar Birds, releases on August 3rd, and you can find her on her website, which is
CherylBostrom.com.
and
CherylBostrom.com.
I'm going to put that in the notes and some links for you both to where you can buy Cheryl's book, where you can follow her on her website, and she writes, did you say every Saturday? And you can find her on her website and also buy her book. And yeah, so thank you so much for being with us. I appreciate it, Cheryl.
My great pleasure. Thank you.